The thing I wanted to get you talking about first is this very interesting psychological phenomenon that I've discussed on this show in different ways on a few occasions, and that's dissociation. And I want to start off by asking you about dissociative identity disorder and how that can manifest neurologically. So tell people about that and what we know about it.
Yeah, dissociation in general is something we are all acquainted with. Non-pathological, mild levels of dissociation happen when you don't remember something. A dream state is partly a dissociative state because you don't identify with the parts of your mind that are generating the dream environment. You only identify with the dream character or avatar. So we can all become dissociated. When we become confused, under stress, that's an example of dissociation. But dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, is an extreme sustained form of dissociation in which one mind appears to fragment itself into multiple distinct or cognitively separate centers of awareness, each one with its own selected memories, with its own dispositions, personality traits. They call themselves by different names. Now, this has existed. We have known about this since the 19th century, but for over a century, there were reasons not to take it seriously because it's not something you could diagnose objectively. So there was always that doubt that the patient was faking it in order to get attention or get away with some socially awkward situations. But with the advent of neuroimaging in the early 21st century, we now have means to diagnose DID objectively using fMRI images. That was work done by Jolanda Schlumpf and her team here in the Netherlands in 2014. We have work done with EEG in Germany in 2015. A woman suffering from DID who claimed to have multiple alters, some of which claimed to be blind. The neuroscientists had this brilliant idea of instrumenting the woman with an EEG cap while a blind alter was in executive control. And lo and behold, there was no brain activity in the visual cortex, even though the woman's eyes were wide open. And we know that her eyes and visual system, organically speaking, work because when a sighted alter was again in control, or the host personality, brain activity in the visual cortex would reappear. So today we know that this is a real condition. It can be objectively diagnosed, and it has the surprising property of having one mind appear to itself as many separate minds.
Interesting. So this case of a woman with a blind alter, that term alter, that just refers to the separate centers of awareness contained within one brain. And you're saying that there was this case study of a woman who could see and her eyes were functioning and everything, but one of her alters claimed to be blind, and they were doing EEG measurements such that when they look at the EEG signal for the visual cortex, the blind alter's EEG looked like an actual person with physical blindness as EEG would look like.
There was no activity. I don't think the neuroscientists went so far as to say it's the same as a blind person, but they couldn't see discernible activity beyond noise levels in the visual cortex, even though her eyes were open. So yeah, that gives you pause for thought, because dissociation seems not only to create islands of mentation that are cognitively isolated, but it seems to be capable of literal blindness.
I see. And in these cases with such individuals, is the default alter or the default person that's speaking, do they claim to be aware of the alters, or are they completely unaware of each other?
You have both cases, because now we can retroactively analyze the clinical literature that was not taken seriously for over a century. So now that we know that the condition is real, now we are sitting on a mountain of data that didn't demand enough attention from us in the past. So it's an abundance of riches now, and there is clinical evidence for both, for alters that are well aware of the other's existences and for alters that are not. And there is, and that's the most interesting part, there is an abundance of clinical evidence, even recent one, research done in Harvard by Deirdre Barrett. There is evidence that alters are co-conscious. In other words, it's not a matter of rebooting the computer with a different operating system. No, the different alters are always present. The ones that are not in executive control they are still conscious, and it can even try to play tricks on the alters that are in executive control, to undermine other alters.
So the other thing this reminds me of, I mean, this can be very, very hard and weird for people to wrap their minds around. But the other, on the topic of just the idea that you can have multiple types of consciousness or multiple centers of awareness within a single brain that may or may not have access to the contents of the other, it reminds me of the famous cases of the so-called split brain patients that are defined in the literature going back several decades now. Are you familiar with those cases?
Yeah, there's contention about, I don't know what you're about to say now, but there is some new results that seem to bring doubt to the earlier conclusions. But go ahead.
Well, can you just describe the sort of classic split brain results and maybe then bring us up to speed on what you just referred to?
Yeah. So there is this notion that if you split the two brain hemispheres, then you get two parallel consciousnesses, and you no longer have a sort of unified field of awareness. I don't think that holds up. If you talk to patients after surgery, they will report to you that they feel exactly the same like they felt before. But some quirks appear, one of which can be a blind sight. Blind sight is when you report to not be able to see, but you act as though you could see. If you report that you cannot see anything on the left side of a visual field and somebody throws you a ball on the left side, you raise your hand and catch it. And if the psychiatrists or the neuroscientists confront you with that, like you claim you cannot see, but you held your hand and you caught the ball, the people will report, well, I just raised my hand by chance. It was just a coincidence. So you have this amazing cognitive dissonances happening. I think what this might show is that impairments of certain types of brain function, when you prevent communication between certain types of brain areas under certain circumstances, what you destroy is metacognition. You destroy your ability not to experience, but to know that you are experiencing, to bring that experience into the microscope of explicit introspection, to examine the contents of your own mind at a metacognitive level. I think that's what's impaired. I wouldn't go as far as to say that split brain patients have two alters. I don't think there is enough clinical basis for that.
I see. And sticking on dissociation for a moment, there's also the phenomenon of acute and reversible dissociation, which can be induced by stressful events, which I think you mentioned earlier, or drugs. And some people have experience with this, where you take a dissociative psychoactive drug. It induces this very bizarre state where it's very hard to describe and wrap your head around. When someone is in this state, they'll say things like, well, I was sitting there and I look around, I see everything. I can see everything in my visual field. I look down at my hand and I see it. So the sensory information is not being disrupted. I understand intellectually that I'm looking at my hand and my arm. And yet somehow the body that you're seeing doesn't really register as belonging to you. And it's very bizarre, but that is the kind of thing that people report. This kind of state can even be induced in animals and experimental situations. And so I'm hoping you can describe for us what you think this means in terms of how the mind is generating a sense of self and integrating the sensory information into its model of itself. Let's get people thinking about how the brain is generating these models.
Yeah, just to sort of dovetail with what you said, there are instances in the literature of people who suffer car crashes, and instead of losing their memories, they lose the sense of ownership of their memories. They remember the entire lives, but they relate to it as if it were the life of somebody else. They say, that was not me. I remember it from a first-person perspective, but that wasn't me. It doesn't feel like it was me. So you can have many types of dissociation. I mean, we just talked about perceptual dissociation. You can't see because you're dissociated from the cognitive mechanisms associated with perception. Ownership, you can lose the feeling of ownership. You can have memory dissociation. Different alters can hold different memories, so you don't have to deal with the stress of knowing everything. So there are many forms of mild and severe dissociation. I think what this tells us is that the mind is a dynamic web of cognitive associations and dissociations. Associations are being formed and unformed all the time. It is a constant dance. It's like the dance of the starlings in the afternoon sky. They come together, they fly apart, they form these intricate patterns. And under ordinary conditions, that's what our minds are doing all the time. We are associating, dissociating, forming different views of the self. And what we call the self is a narrative that emerges from this dance. And it's a narrative that almost invariably is not based on the data. It's not based on reason. That narrative itself is a sort of a byproduct of this cognitive associative dance that characterizes what mind is.